and 19:20 show that God's presence is not substantiated by the existence of miracles. One need only read Exodus 7:11-12, 8:7, and 2 Thessalonians 2:8-9 to see that many biblical figures, both good and bad, perform miracles. Matthew 24:23-24, and Deuteronomy 13:1-3 specifically state that miracles are not to be used as a test for God's presence. Just because someone thinks miracles are being performed doesn't mean they're dealing with God. 16th. In Colossians 1:15, Paul said, quote, "Who," he's talking about Jesus, "is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature." The problems with this are, A, if Jesus and God are equal, how could either be born? And B, in no sense could Jesus be considered the firstborn, either as a man or as a God. As a God, he could never have been born to begin with, and as a man, he lived long before many people. He lived long after many people had already been born. 17th. In Hebrews 1:2, Paul muddied the waters mightily by saying, "God has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds," unquote. An heir is appointed for that time when the appointer dies or is incapacitated. In effect, Paul is saying God will die or become incapacitated, and Jesus will fall heir to his kingdom, which is preposterous. 18th. While talking about the Levitical priesthood in Hebrews 7:11, Paul erroneously stated, quote, "Under it the people received the law." In fact, in the form of the Ten Commandments and other rules, the law was given to the Israelites long before the Levitical priesthood emerged. The priesthood and temple service were switched from the responsibility of the firstborn Israelites to the tribe of Levi after the Israelites had worshipped the golden calf, which the Levites refused to do, and after the law had arrived on the scene. 19th. Paul created some false history when he said the following in Galatians 4:22-24. "It is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, Hagar, the other by a free woman, Sarah. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar," unquote. The law was given from Sinai to the descendants of the free woman Sarah through Isaac, and not to the descendants of the bondwoman Hagar through Ishmael. 20th. In Hebrews 7:2-3, Paul said Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, a priest continually. Although Genesis 14:18 implies Melchizedek was only a priest, Paul gives him qualities that are possessed only by Jesus. And since Jesus is God, Melchizedek must be little short of divine himself. Otherwise, he is not like the Son of God, as Paul claims. 21st. In Hebrews 11:13, Paul, the alleged messenger of God, accuses God of breaking his promise to Abraham. Paul says, "These all died in faith, not having received what was promised," that is, promised by God, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, unquote. In effect, he's accusing God of lying. They didn't receive what God promised. They merely observed it from a distance. 22nd. In 1 Corinthians 10:24, Paul says, "Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth." This verse speaks for itself. Don't seek your own wealth. Seek somebody else's. 23rd. Paul showed his allegiance to expediency and opportunism by being a religious chameleon. In 1 Corinthians 9:20-23, he said, "Unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them who are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain those who are under the law. To them who are without the law, as without the law, that I might gain those who are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake," unquote. How's that for pure opportunism? Sounds like your typical politician. 24th. In 1 Corinthians 10:23, Paul said, "All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not." In effect, the allegedly moral Paul looked upon himself as his own lawgiver. And to think Nixon was accused of considering himself above the law and operating by expediency. 25th. In Galatians 2:11-12, Paul criticized Peter by saying, "When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to the face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group," unquote. Paul accused Peter of acting on expediency. Yet in 1 Corinthians 9:22, Paul admits that he was all things to all men. That sounds like your common garden variety politician. 26. In Acts 26:23, Paul said that Christ should suffer and be the first who should rise from the dead. Jesus certainly wasn't the first to rise from the dead, as anyone who is acquainted with the Old Testament or the Gospels knows all too well. 27th. In several respects, 27th, in several verses, Paul openly admitted he spoke foolishly, which more than his followers are willing to concede. Key verses in this respect are 2 Corinthians 11:17. "What I am saying, I say not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool, in this boastful confidence." 2 Corinthians 11:21, "I speak foolishly." 2 Corinthians 11:23, "I speak as a fool." 2 Corinthians 11:1, "I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness." Do bear with me. And 2 Corinthians 12:11, "I have become a fool in glorying," unquote. 28. In 2 Corinthians 11:8-9, Paul said, "I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service." This is another one of those verses that speaks for itself and hardly needs a comment. 29th. In Ephesians 2:8-9, Paul made one of his most quoted statements. "For by grace ye are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." Unfortunately, he erred. The act of accepting by faith is a work itself. You must take an affirmative act in order to be saved.